How can we provide feedback more effectively for students? First, we need to ask, what is feedback? Although there are multiple ways to think about feedback, we should highlight a few critical aspects. First, you can't have feedback without also having a goal or a standard for which you are aiming or against which to compare. We need feedback from the student. Feedback must be provided to the student. And finally, it's important to think about feedback as a system where there's a goal or a standard to which the student aspires. We get some feedback from the student to assess their performance against the standard. We create opportunities for the student to get some information back. The student can then adjust their performance, and we can then reassess, all as part of an ongoing process of continuous improvement in each student's personal performance. One researcher, John Hattie, decided to go back and look at all of the studies that had been done up to that time that addressed interventions designed to improve learning. He asked a very simple question: how much of an effect do such interventions have, and how does this compare to other factors? Well, here's what he found. Of all the various learning interventions that have been studied, feedback interventions had the greatest effect on student learning. Across all interventions, he computed an average effect size of 0.4. But the effect size for feedback interventions was an astounding 1.13, nearly 3 times greater than the average effect size of all the interventions combined. Now, to put this in context, of all the things you can do to improve learning, feedback interventions will have the greatest impact, more than teacher characteristics, more than developmental factors. And feedback interventions didn't just mean providing feedback, but also getting feedback from the students about their current level of performance, to identify difficulties that they might be having so that they can improve moving forward. In fact, we might say, feed forward. Okay, let's now look at the research on feedback specifically. In an exhaustive meta-analysis of studies on feedback interventions, the authors identified approximately 5,000 academic works on feedback, 2,500 papers, and 500 technical reports. The first bad news, out of those 5,000 works, only 131 were sufficiently rigorous and scientific to be included in the meta-analysis. Moral to this story, don't believe everything you read because most of it doesn't meet basic standards of science or conform to accepted scientific principles about what is best for feedback. More bad news. They found that 1/3 of feedback interventions actually negatively impacted performance. That's right, feedback interventions actually hurt performance in certain cases. So we need to ask why. What differentiated feedback interventions that gave positive effects from those that had negative consequences or effects? Basically, it depends on whether the feedback centers on task or ego. Feedback that threatens my ego, my person, will cause me to tune out, to shut down. On the other hand, if feedback addresses the task, the student will remain cognitively engaged. For example, I might say, try looking at the task from another perspective. Talk to me about that a bit. How can you improve your performance by taking this different approach? Now the feedback is task-oriented, not ego-involving. And that leads to improvements in performance rather than performance declines. Let's look at some overall evidence-based recommendations for what we can say about feedback. The one thing we want to do is we want feedback to be specific. It has to be directly related to the task at hand or the performance issue at hand. So we really want to make sure that it is specific and not vague. It needs to be timely. We can't be waiting weeks after and then expect our feedback to have a good impact on performance. We should address advancement toward a goal because we need to remind students what they're aiming for, and we should always address our feedback directed toward achieving that goal. We also need to present that feedback carefully, keep it task-oriented and not ego-involving. So as soon as you put a grade on a paper, students shut down. So it's much better to give feedback prior to assigning grades so that they have a chance to think about it and they will be attentive to that feedback. And it needs to involve the learner if at all possible. If the learner can find their own way to the solution to their deficit in performance or find a way to perform better, it's going to be much more effective than if we simply stand there and show them step by step how to do something. A few years ago, prominent scholars on feedback were invited to each write an article for an issue of Educational Leadership that was devoted solely to best practices in feedback. This is a wonderful infographic that summarizes their advice, titled 7 Things to Remember About Feedback. First of all, feedback is information. It's not advice, praise, or evaluation. Again, task-oriented, not ego-involving. We want to create a safe place for students to make mistakes. There's got to be nothing wrong with making a mistake if we take our mistakes and our failures and we turn it around and we get better. The feedback from students may be more critical than the feedback given. Again, we talk about feedback, and from most people who teach, they're thinking about the feedback they're giving students, but we remember we need to also learn to listen. Let's absorb things a little bit ourselves so that we understand how they are making mistakes and how they are misunderstanding the task at hand, so that we can figure out what is the appropriate feedback to give to them. Once you grade or evaluate, students stop listening. There was a lovely study where they looked basically at students, and as soon as the students saw the grades on their paper, they didn't read another comment on the paper. Leave the grading and evaluation for the end and keep learning aside and apart from that kind of grading and evaluation so that students are much more open to receiving it. Feedback must occur while students are still learning. So we want to make sure that we're doing it early enough and often enough before the culmination of a semester or before the culmination of a course. Beware of peer feedback, which is frequent and often wrong. There's a lot written about getting feedback from peers, and peers can give some amazing feedback. But at the same time, those peers are not experts themselves. Let's make sure that we give other types of feedback, particularly task-oriented feedback, which is direct. Finally, without a goal or learning target, feedback is just telling students what to do. If you don't know where you're going, how are you going to be able to get there? So we really want to have that target or goal, and we don't want to make it secret for the students. They need to know what that is. Thank you for joining us. We hope that this video has given you some sound research-based ideas for maximizing the positive impacts of feedback and making it the cornerstone of student learning both in and out of the classroom. We close with some additional resources that you may find helpful.